Hello everybody, this is Dr. Christopher White and welcome back for part 3 of Paleozoic life history, focusing on the plants and the vertebrates. So before we go any further, let's just get the code word out of the way. The code word for this presentation is wizard. I repeat, wizard. That's W-I-Z-A-R-D. So that's wizard. So please make sure you write that down, put it somewhere safe because you'll need it for the code word quiz. Okay, so at the end of the previous presentation we've been discussing the lobe-finned fish and how they had begun to show indications that they were slowly evolving to have tetrapod limbs, so essentially the kinds of limbs we get in animals like amphibians and reptiles. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to continue that evolutionary story. So now we're going to start looking at the evolution of fish to the amphibians. So the amphibians were the first permanent vertebrates on land. Now, by the time the amphibians actually made it onto land, they weren't alone. The plants had already been there for millions of years, and so had the arthropods, so that includes insects, spiders, millipedes and scorpions, and the snails, the gastropods. So they were already there, they were already well established. Now, amphibians had to overcome several issues as they transitioned from the seas onto the land. The first and most obvious one is desiccation. If you're used to living in a water-rich environment, you don't have to worry about drying out. The second you leave that water-rich environment and start moving across dry land, all of a sudden you're at risk of drying out, and if you dehydrate, obviously that can eventually lead to you dying. So desiccation is a very serious problem. The next problem you have to overcome is reproduction. So if you're used to reproducing in open water, well obviously that's a technique that's great if you're in a river or a lake or the ocean, but once again, the second you come out onto dry land, it's a very serious problem that you have to overcome. So how are you going to reproduce in these new environments? The next problem is gravity. So if you're a fish and you're living in water, gravity isn't really a problem because the water around you helps to support your body. The second you come out of the water though, and you're on dry land, you're exposed to the full force of gravity because there's no water there to help you. And so this means that if you don't have strong enough bones and strong enough muscles, you will just collapse. And if you collapse, that means you won't be able to inflate your lungs properly and you'll suffocate. So you need to come up with a strong enough body plan to allow you to overcome the force of gravity. The final problem you need to overcome is the extraction of oxygen from the air. Now, luckily by this point, the lungfish have already begun to overcome this issue, so this is a slightly easier one to fix. So the early model for the formation of amphibians is that it occurs in the late Devonian, and we begin to see this transition from tetrapodomorphian fish to primitive amphibians. So a good example of that would be an organism like Ichthyostega. Now, there are some gaps in the morphology, but the link is pretty clear, and we have a reasonably solid body of evidence to show this transition. So just to give you some idea, this is what Ichthyostega looks like. So we can see once again we have this broad flat skull, we have the eyes located on the top, and in the case of Ichthyostega we have very powerful, very well developed pectoral and pelvic limbs. So based on the fossil evidence that we had, it appeared that the transition from fish to amphibians was timed to approximately the late Devonian. However, this has been challenged a little bit in more recent times. So in the Holy Cross Mountains of Poland, we actually have tetrapod footprints in Middle Devonian age sediments. That's about 395 million years ago. Also, over time, we've managed to build up a larger body of fossil evidence, which also shows the appearance of tetrapod-like organisms also in the approximately Middle Devonian period. Now, this obviously means that the timing of the amphibian invasion is a little bit more open to interpretation. Now, there is obviously the argument that, well, yes, that these organisms possibly could have had the capacity to have left water for a period of time, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are staying on dry land. And so this is a problem that's very, very difficult to be able to explain. I mean, maybe these tetrapod footprints actually just represent an animal that left the water for a little while and then went back in. So this is something we can't really answer based on the evidence that we have. So all we can really say is, yes, there are indicators that this transition may have occurred in the Middle Devonian. However, the fossils that we have, they don't quite meet the specifications required for living on dry land. and also the footprints that we have, well, you can't definitively prove that those were from an animal that was actually living on dry land 100% of the time. Now, one of the other questions we need to explain is, well, why did legs actually develop? I mean, after all, if you're a fish, a fin is an absolutely brilliant thing. It works perfectly. We can see how successful fins are, courtesy of the ray-finned fish. They're 99% of all fish. Fins work well. So why develop these more muscular limbs? So the current explanation is that these more muscular limbs that the lobe-finned fish have essentially came into play because it made it easier for the animals to move around in streams, lakes and swamps, because these are environments where you have lots and lots of obstacles. You have bits of plant material like a fallen tree, you have big rocks, and you have just a plethora of other assorted debris. So there's lots of stuff that's going to get in your way. So if you're a standard ray-finned fish living in the ocean, you don't really have to worry about that kind of thing. However, if you're a lobe-finned fish who mostly live in these freshwater environments, you are going to find these problems in your way quite a lot of the time. And so this means that if you have powerful limbs that would allow you to pull yourself around or over these obstacles, you have an evolutionary advantage. Now, just going back to those footprints from Poland, now once again, they're about 395 million years old. Where they're actually found is a carbonate lagoon. Now, a carbonate lagoon is a saline environment. Now, this is obviously a little bit confusing because you would naturally assume that the transitions for fish to amphibians would be the fish would eventually go from saline environments to freshwater environments, then the freshwater fish would evolve into the amphibians, and then the amphibians obviously move on to the land. And obviously that would be a relatively logical succession, because you would assume that the fish would adapt to freshwater conditions before, and that would then allow them to move on to the dry land, obviously in which fresh water is the primary water source. Now, these footprints we're finding from Poland, on the other hand, as I said, are in these carbonate lagoon sediments, which are going to be saline waters. And so this does bring about the possible idea that the first amphibians may have actually come from saline environments and moved onto the land from there. Now, this is a very argued over idea, so I'm going to make that clear right now. Logic decrees that chances are the amphibians evolved from freshwater fish, but this evidence would suggest there is the possibility that the amphibians actually evolved from fish which were in saline environments. Now, the one caveat I will add is that this is a lagoon environment, and lagoon environments are a mixture of water that comes off the land and water that's coming from the oceans. So there is the possibility that this carbonate lagoon might not have actually been that saline. It could have been slightly more fresh water than salt water. So there is that possibility that also needs to be considered. Now, in order to move on land, the tetrapods not only had to develop strong limbs, but they also need to develop strong mounting points for those limbs, which means they need strong rib cages and strong pelvises. Now, the reason for this is you can have very strong limbs. However, if you don't have a strong enough mounting point, the second you try and use those limbs, you're actually going to hurt yourself, because the big strong muscles from those limbs are obviously going to put stresses on the bones, like your ribs or your pelvis. And if they're not strong enough, those muscles are literally going to break ribs or damage your pelvis in some way. So when you are talking about this transition from water onto the land, you not only need to develop strong limbs, but you need to develop a robust skeleton overall. Now, one of the earliest examples of an organism which could represent this transitional form between tetrapodomorphian fish and amphibians proper is an organism called Acanthostega. And I'm actually just going to bring up a picture of Acanthostega in the background there. Now, it's one of the earliest tetrapod fish around, and it's a very, very common organism, so it looks like it was actually pretty successful. Now, when you look at it, you think to yourself, that's an organism that looks like it could have transitioned from the water onto dry land. It has the basic appearance that you would expect. Now the problem is though, is that when we actually start to look at the skeleton in greater detail and crunch some numbers, we actually see that it didn't probably have the capacity to support its own weight, so the legs weren't strong enough. This would have meant that Acanthostega could have maybe left the water, but the second it was on dry land, the limbs wouldn't have been able to hold the body up. That obviously means that the Acanthostega's undercarriage would have been resting on the ground, and this would obviously mean that it would have had difficulty expanding and contracting its chest, which would have meant it would have had difficulty breathing, and so there's a chance the organism could have suffocated. The other problem is that the mounting points for these limbs onto the main torso were not strong enough. So even if Acanthostega could have made it out of the water and was able to support its own body weight, the second it tried to take a step, chances are it would have ended up breaking a bone. So yes, although it has the correct basic body design, it also had lungs along with gills. Chances are it probably spent most of its time in the water because it needed the water to offer its support. Now, that doesn't mean to say it didn't occasionally exit the water for very short periods of time, but if it did, it wasn't moving onto the land for extended periods. It would have been out of the water for maybe a few minutes at a time, and then it would have returned. Now, within the same Upper Devonian sediments that contain Acanthostega fossils, we also have pieces of bone and partial amphibian skeletons from genuses such as Ichthyostega, which is the organism we saw a couple of slides ago. Now, in the case of Ichthyostega, it does actually show strong legs which could have supported the weight of the body. It had a strong backbone, a strong rib cage, and strong pelvic and pectoral girdles. That means you had the robust skeleton that you're looking for, the kind of skeleton that could support the weight of an animal on dry land, and the kind of skeleton that would have been capable of supporting the muscle strength that would have been required to actually move those limbs. So when it comes down to it, it looks like Ichthyostega is probably the better choice for the transitional fossil that takes us from these tetrapod fish through to the amphibians. So there's the Acanthostega fossil there. Now, another strong contender for the intermediate species that's going to bridge this gap is an organism called Tiktaalik. Now, Tiktaalik occurs in late Devonian sediments found in Ellesmere Island in Canada. So the organism itself possessed gills and scales like a fish, and it had a broad skull with eyes on the top of its head. It had a flexible neck, it had lungs, and it had a large rib cage that looks like it could support the body weight of the organism when it was on land or in the water. So those are all tetrapod characteristics. So it has fish characteristics, the gills and the scales, but it also has this broad flat skull, eyes on top of the head, flexible neck, lungs, and a large rib cage, which are more tetrapod characteristics. So if you look over here, you can actually see a generalized diagram of what we think Tiktaalik looked like. So, if you look at it, you can see the similarities between it and a very early amphibian. Now, on top of all that, it also has the beginnings of true tetrapod forelimbs. So if we look at the forelimb design, we can begin to see that it really does have a limb that's looking a lot like a tetrapod. And so this is a good indicator that it may well be an excellent candidate for the intermediate species. Now, the tetrapod forelimb of the Tiktaalik fossil shows a functional set of wrist bones, and it has 5 digits. It also has the modifications in the ear region, which if you're moving onto land is going to be very, very important, because if you want to be successful on land, a good sense of hearing is going to be essential. So although Ichthyostega does offer the possibility of being the intermediate species, you can't also overlook Tiktaalik as well. It's also a possible intermediate organism as well. So just to give you some idea, by the way, so here's Tiktaalik here. So you can see there's the single bone, so that would be akin to the the humerus, for instance. Then you've got the radius and the ulna, and then you have the wrist bones, and then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 digits. In case of the Canthostega, there's a Canthostega there. Once again, we have the humerus, radius, ulna, and then we have the phalanges. Now we haven't got a particularly well developed set of wrist or palm bones there though. And then we move on to organisms like the Tulproton. And as you can see, by this point, we're into this Ichthyostega-like design. We have this very well-built body, very strong forelimbs and hind limbs. We have this flat skull with eyes located on the top, nostrils at the front. And so at this point, you have an organism that will be capable of moving onto dry land. So just to give you some idea, so this diagram here kind of broadly summarizes what we're looking at. So if you look, we have time on the bottom. So we got 385 million years ago here. So this is kind of Middle Devonian, moving up to 360 million years ago here. And you can see we have this steady transition from these tetrapodomorphian fish to these animals, to these more intermediate species, shall we say. So we've got Tiktaalik, we've got Ichthyostega, and we've got a Canthostega here. So the Canthostega probably couldn't actually make it onto the land for extended periods, but Tiktaalik and Ichthyostega, on the other hand, are good candidates for being the intermediate species between these tetrapodomorphian fish and the amphibians. The next thing we need to talk about is amphibian reproduction. Now, adult amphibians have to overcome the problem of desiccation, so that's drying out, and they get around this by covering themselves in a layer of slime, and that stops their skin from drying. They also need to overcome the same problem when it comes to reproduction. Now, the issue that amphibians have is that they produce a gelatinous egg. So you have an outer coating, which essentially is a gelatin-like material, and that outer coating is going to protect a water-filled sac in the middle, and within that sac you're going to have a yolk plug, which will be the food source, and the embryo. The problem is that gelatin is not a particularly great material to make your eggs from. It's a particularly weak material, so it breaks quite easily, and it's not exactly watertight. It's prone to drying out. So if you were to leave a gelatinous egg in a dry environment, the gelatin would dry and harden, it would crack, and then the water-rich interior would become exposed and it would evaporate away, at which point the egg would be useless. Now, this means that amphibians therefore have to lay their eggs in water-rich environments. Water-rich environments offer additional protection, so the gelatin coating is less likely to get damaged, and the water-rich environment also stops the gelatin coating from drying out. Now, this obviously means, therefore, that amphibians can't move too far from sources of water, because they have to be near a source of water in order to successfully reproduce. And this obviously limits the ability of the amphibians to push out and colonize the wider continental environment. So what we really need is we need to essentially improve on egg design if we want our organisms to be able to push out onto the wider continents. Now, this therefore leads to the formation of the amniote egg, and the amniote egg makes its appearance in the late Carboniferous. Now, to be clear, amniote eggs belong to the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals. So amphibians do not produce them. So the appearance of the amniote egg is an indicator that essentially amphibians have begun to transition into reptiles. Now, the amniote egg is a much more robust design. So it has a hard outer shell, labelled here on this diagram as 1. So this shell not only offers protection, but it also helps to seal off the interior. So it stops the interior of the egg from drying out. So inside our egg, we're going to have a protective membrane, and within that protective membrane, we're going to have the amnion. What we would, if we think about a chicken egg, we would call the egg white. So within the amnion, we're going to have the embryo itself, marked out here as 11. And the embryo is going to be connected to a yolk sac, which is going to be for food, and a waste sac for any waste products that it produces. Now, what this means is essentially you have yourself a fully self-contained vessel which is robustly constructed. So this means in theory you can lay an amniote egg pretty much anywhere, and it should in theory be able to survive and produce a viable offspring. Now, the other thing that an amnio egg does is it gets round the larval stage. So in the case of an amphibian egg, so think of frog spawn, the frog spawn itself isn't that big. So once the embryo starts to develop, it's eventually going to get to the point where it's going to start straining the gelatinous coating, and eventually it's going to cause that coating to fail. And so this means that once the embryo develops far enough, it will break out of the gelatinous egg, and it will then move into the water-rich environment, where it will then go through the larva stage. So think of a tadpole as the classic example of that process. Now, in the case of an amniote egg, on the other hand, the embryo is in this nice, safe, water-rich environment, and so it will actually undergo its larval stage within the amniote egg. Now, this means that once the embryo has reached sufficient size and has sufficient strength, it will then push through the hard eggshell, at which point you will have a young, which is essentially a miniature version of a fully formed adult. Now, once the amniote egg arrives, there's pretty much no limit to where organisms can go. And so this then allows the reptiles in particular to move into new environments that other animals like the amphibians had not been able to colonize. And so it gives the reptiles this environmental niche. It gives them an environment in which they can move into, expand and diversify. And so it's going to really help the reptiles to become a very big, very diverse group of organisms. So in terms of reptiles, they are separated from the amphibians based on a range of different factors, and these factors include things like the skin, the skull structure, the jawbone design, the location of the ears, the limb design, the spinal column design, and obviously the ability to produce amniote eggs. So there are numerous differences between the amphibians and the reptiles. One of the most obvious ones is, of course, the skin. So in the case of the amphibians, of course, they have to cover themselves in this layer of slime in order to stop their skin from drying out. Now, this is actually a very, very inefficient system, because it means the amphibian is constantly wasting water to produce this slime. So it means that if the amphibian's away from a source of water for a long enough period of time, it will begin to essentially dehydrate, because it's wasting all this water to make the slime to try and stop itself drying out. Now, in the case of the reptiles, they get around this problem in a far more simplistic fashion. They just develop a thick layer of scaly skin, and this essentially acts as a barrier to stop significant amounts of water being lost through evaporation. So, very simple, very elegant way around that problem. Now, the first reptile that we come across in the fossil record is an organism called Westlovenia, and it's from Middle Carboniferous rocks from Scotland in the United Kingdom. Now, the first thing you might have noticed is that I've just gone and said that this organism is a reptile and therefore it will be producing amniote eggs. But of course, in the previous slide, I just went and stated that we don't really have amniote eggs until the late Carboniferous. Now, the reason for this is that although Westlovenia is a reptilian organism, we don't actually have any examples of it producing eggs. So chances are, yes, it did produce amniote eggs, but we don't actually have any evidence of that. And so when it comes to discussing the appearance of the amniote egg, we can't say definitively that we have them until the late Carboniferous, although in all likelihood Westlovenia and other organisms related to it were probably producing amniote eggs in the Middle Carboniferous. So just bear that in mind. It's just a question of do we or don't we have the direct evidence to prove it. Now, although there are large differences between reptiles and amphibians, there are also strong similarities. And this would suggest that the two groups have a common ancestor, and that common ancestor was a group of organisms which we call labyrinthodonts. And we believe that the split between the amphibians and the reptiles occurred in the early to middle Carboniferous, and that would be consistent with the first appearance of Westlovenia. Now, the early reptiles are smaller and more agile, and they're more loosely grouped into an organism which we call the protothyrids. And just to give you some idea of the size of Westlovenia, chances are it probably could have fitted quite comfortably on the palm of your hand. It was a pretty small organism. So during the Permian, the reptiles begin to diversify, and they pretty quickly start to outcompete the amphibians. Now, the thing we need to remember is that as we transition from the Carboniferous into the Permian, we're going through a period of global warming. So this means the global environment is on the whole becoming hotter and drier. Now, this means that we're going to start losing those hot, very wet environments which are very common in the Carboniferous. So we're going to start losing those coal-forming swamps and those, those boggy environments, which are normally great environments for the amphibians. Now, those environments are going to start being replaced by drier conditions, so you're going to have more temperate environments. You're also going to have an increase in the amount of arid and semi-arid environments as well. So you're going to see more desert and semi-desert environments appearing. Now, this is a serious problem for the amphibians because this means the amount of water-rich environments as a whole is going to be decreasing, and so they're going to have a bit of a problem. Now, at the same time, the reptiles are making their move, and the reptiles have several advantages over the amphibians which are going to allow them to exploit these new environments. Now, the first advantage is one we've already touched on. It's the presence of the amniote egg. Now, this of course means that reptiles can lay their eggs in pretty much any environment, and they should in theory be able to produce viable offspring. This is something of course the amphibians cannot do. So this means that reptiles don't have to tie themselves to a source of water in order to be able to successfully reproduce. Now, reptiles also have more advanced jaws and teeth. Their jaw design is just more robust, it's stronger. Now, this means that reptiles can therefore exploit food sources that an amphibian could never ever use. So, because it has a powerful jaw, it means it can essentially bite into, it can chew food that, amphibians otherwise would not be able to use. And this powerful jaw is also backed up by the presence of very, very strong teeth. And of course, teeth, as we've already discussed, are a very helpful tool when it comes to being able to bite through stuff and chew stuff. They're a great advantage, and they're something that the amphibians don't really have. So the other thing that the reptiles have is of course tougher skin and scales, and this helps to prevent desiccation. They don't need to cover themselves in a layer of slime to stop their bodies drying out. And as we've already discussed, keeping this layer of slime going is a very water intensive process because the layer of slime is constantly drying out and it constantly needs to be replenished. Reptiles, on the other hand, go, nope, don't need the slime layer. I'll just cover myself in this thick layer of skin and that will do exactly the same job, and it means I don't have to waste a load of water in the process. And so this helps to essentially retain allow the reptiles to retain more water, and so once again it means they can push out into these more arid and semi-arid environments. The final thing the reptiles can do is, on the whole, they're just plain faster than amphibians, and so this makes them more efficient, especially when it comes to things like hunting. So the diversification of the reptiles is eventually going to lead to the rise of a group of organisms called the plesiosaurs. And these are often referred to as the fin-backed reptiles. And I'm just going to bring up a picture of one in the background there, and you can quite clearly see this is a group of reptiles that has a big flat sail on the back. So this is essentially the fin. Now, the plesiosaurs evolved from the early reptiles during the late Carboniferous, and they were the dominant reptile group by the early Permians. They're a very successful group, and they have both herbivores and carnivores within the group. So they're clearly exploiting a range of different food sources in a range of different environments, which is another indicator of just how successful they're being. Now, most of the plesiosaurs have a sail on the back of some size. Some of them can be quite big, some of them can be quite small. So this Dimetrodon we can see in the background here clearly has a very, very large sail. Now, in terms of the sail itself, you can see it's supported by these bone spines, and each one of these bone spines actually is part of a vertebrae. And so this sail is actually part of the spinal column. Now, why they developed the sail is a little bit uncertain. There's a few possible reasons. The first one is it could simply be for defense. Having this huge sail on the back of your body makes you look a lot bigger. And of course, the bigger and scarier the animal is, the less likely it is to be attacked. The other possibility is that they could be for mating displays. So, maybe the larger the sail or the more colourful the sail, the more likely the animal is to successfully find a mate. The final option is that it could be for temperature regulation. So there's the possibility that, let's say in the morning, your plesiosaur wakes up. It needs to obviously start warming up its blood because it's a reptile, and it wants to do this as fast as possible. So what it can do is it can actively pump the blood into the fin. The fin obviously gets heated up by the sunlight because it's such a big area, and that means any blood within the fin gets warmed through very, very quickly, and then that blood can obviously then be passed into the body, and then that will help to warm the reptile up faster. That means it can get going more quickly. It also helps to actually control temperature if the organism is getting too hot. So in the event the reptile is beginning to overheat, all it needs to do is it needs to find a shaded area. It can then start to pump blood through the fin, and then the blood passing through the fin is going to cool down, so it's going to lose heat to the surrounding atmosphere. And so this is going to help to produce cooler blood, which can then be passed into the main body, and it'll help to cool the reptile down. And so, so chances are the fin is probably mostly for temperature control, but it may have other reasons, reasons for having it as well. And so there's a Dimetrodon, just for some idea. Dimetrodons, by the way, as you can quite clearly see from the jaw design and the tooth design, were predators. So the plesiosaurs die out during the Permian, and they're succeeded by the thrapsids. Now the thrapsids are a group of mammal-like reptiles, and they're actually descended from the carnivorous plesiosaur lineage, so they're going to be related to organisms like Dimetrodon. So the thrapsids come in a range of size, everywhere from relatively small ones, about the size of a small dog, all the way through to kind of medium-sized examples, which are going to be about the size of a cow. Now, the thing about the thrapsids is they are starting to display features that we would consider to be mammalian. So they have features like fused skulls, enlarged jawbones, differentiated teeth, which is a very big mammalian trait, and also the placement of limbs under the body. Now, these changes are all hinting at a slow evolutionary process that's beginning to essentially form mammals from the reptile lineage. Now, the movement of the legs under the body is especially important because it helps to increase movement speed. So if we just go back to the Dimetrodon skeleton here, Dimetrodon picture should I say, you'll be able to see that the legs are pretty much sticking straight out of the side of the body. Now this would have meant that the Dimetrodon would be moving in a similar way to an alligator or a crocodile. So chances are it was on the whole relatively slow. It probably spent quite a lot of its time with its belly almost touching the ground, and it probably could do bursts of speed. So it probably could move fast for very short periods of time, but on the whole it probably wasn't a particularly quick animal. Now, when you actually move the legs underneath the body, on the other hand, the legs are directly supporting the weight of the body, and this makes movement far more efficient. And so what we see with the thrapsids is, chances are they can move a lot faster than organisms like the plesiosaurs. And so this is obviously going to give them a significant evolutionary advantage. Now, the other thing that we begin to see with the thrapsids is we do see indications that they may have been endothermics. They could have been warm-blooded. Now, this also has several advantages. Warm-blooded animals obviously don't have to waste time warming up during the morning to get going. It also means that because they're warm-blooded, they can move into environments that are slightly colder, so they can start moving into higher latitude environments which reptiles would normally not colonize because the conditions aren't really that warm. So in terms of the thrapsids, they end up making up about 90% of known reptiles by the end of the Permian. However, their numbers were hit very, very hard by the Permo-Trias mass extinction. And the Permo-Trias mass extinction removes about 66% of all reptiles and amphibians from the fossil record. So finally, this then brings us on to the dinosaurs, who are obviously going to be appearing in the Mesozoic. So the dinosaurs would evolve from a group of organisms called the thecodonts. Now the thecodonts are a group of crocodilian-like reptiles, and they are separate from the thrapsids. So by the end of the Permian, what you have is essentially, several different groups of reptiles, of which two of them, arguably the two most important ones, are the thrapsids, which are going to give rise to the mammals, and the thecodonts, which are going to give rise to the dinosaurs. And so just to give you some idea of what the thrapsids look like, you can see that they do have a very reptilian appearance. However, you will notice that the limbs are moving underneath the body. And if you look at them, you can see that, yes, they do appear to be reptilian, but there are certain traits when you look at them that make you think, yes, I can kind of see how they look like a tetrapod mammal. Okay, so that's it for this presentation, so thank you for listening, and take care.